Well, good evening. I hope, as I said at the beginning of service tonight, that you're all having a good week. For those of you who are watching us online tonight, we want to welcome you to our Wednesday evening service. We're thankful for all that this church has done, and I can say that personally. I'm so thankful as a part of our ministry staff for all that our church has done for our community as of late. We had the Refresh BISD school supply giveaway just a couple of weeks ago, and several of you were able to attend that. Even more of you were able to donate to that, and just a great way for us to start this back to school time, remembering to take care of those in our community who need it most. Last Sunday, we had our back to school blessings, and I just thought that it was a great time, an awesome day that we got to spend in prayer over our students and our parents and our teachers as we prepare to send our church family, a lot of our members of our church family, back into our community at large. I love seeing our church family when we come together and we make the most important things, truly the most important things, not just when we say they're important, but when we show they're important through our actions. And so I wanted to thank all of you for uplifting me over these past few weeks that we've had together. Tonight we're going to be continuing our series that we just began last week, studying 2 Chronicles. Stephen shared that while 2 Chronicles may not be the book that you would mention first when you're thinking of the books that you love reading the most, that although that might not be the case, we believe that it could be one of your favorites by the time that we're done studying it together. It has just some absolutely awesome and incredible stories about what God did for the children of Israel. And it's such a rich text because it shows us what it looks like whenever God's people faithfully and sometimes unfaithfully serve their God. Stephen talked about 2 Chronicles, and our theme, as you can see up on our screen tonight for this series, is history worth repeating. And so tonight we're going to jump into that story of 2 Chronicles and see why the writer of Chronicles, looking back hundreds of years into Judah's past, why it is that he thinks these stories are history worth repeating, and worth repeating to the people not only in his time, but even for us today. In what ways is this history that we're going to study tonight about God's people worth repeating in our world? We're going to set out to answer those questions tonight, at least for the first 5 chapters or so of 2 Chronicles. Now, some of you, don't worry, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but we're going to be covering just a little part of Solomon's life here together tonight. I asked my students this question towards the beginning of every school year, and this year they did not disappoint me with their answers. I asked them, if you could have one thing that was in your pocket at all times, and no matter what it was, it would fit in your pocket, then what would you choose? Well, as you can imagine, middle school students are pretty funny whenever it comes to answering questions like this one. One of them said they would like to have a giraffe in their pocket at all times. He didn't say if it was a baby or full grown. One of them wanted a dirt bike. One of them just wanted gum. Talking about just the simple things in life. He said, if I could just have gum in my pocket, that would be fine by me. Their answers ranged from the mundane to the extravagant, but almost every student, whenever they would share their answer, there would be someone else in that circle in my room who would immediately, no matter what their answer was, they would want to change their answer. They would look at each other and they would say, hey, that was a good answer. And then they would start trying to one-up that answer. It would maybe set off a spark in their mind and they would say, I have a different answer, an even better answer this time. It didn't take long before one student found the ultimate answer. And this is what they said. You'll never guess what the best answer they could come up with was. And this just stopped everyone else in the class. They said, I want a pocket. I want multiple pockets inside of my pocket with even more magic items inside of it. And of course, the kids decided that this was the best answer, and for the rest of my day, I had to rephrase the question, that you could not have more magic pockets, or later on, a genie's lamp with 3 wishes, or later on, something that allowed you to carry the whole world, including all of the magical pockets in it, inside of your pocket. You know how much fun they are, don't you? Sometimes I think that when we read Solomon's story, we kind of, like my kids, saw that student who answered that he wanted more pockets. We kind of see Solomon's story as him picking the very perfect thing. Solomon was the son of David, who was the greatest king of Israel in the eyes of the Chronicles audience, and probably in our eyes as well. Like, David is known as the greatest king of Israel, and Solomon's his son. After David passes away, Solomon rises to power, and we know him probably, at least tonight, for one very important story. If you were to ask people, what do you know about Solomon? They might not be able to tell you everything, but they could probably tell you this one thing. And it's a story about Solomon's wisdom. So we're going to start off with that story tonight. It's recorded for us in 2 Chronicles chapter 1. Phil read just a piece of this passage a minute ago, so if you want to be turning there, you can turn to 2 Chronicles 1 tonight. We'll be starting in verse 1 together. Right off the bat, this is what we're told. Solomon, son of David, strengthened himself in his kingdom. The Lord his God was with him and made him exceedingly great. Solomon summoned all Israel, the commanders of the thousands and of the hundreds, the judges, and all the leaders of all Israel, the heads of the families. And then Solomon and the whole assembly with him went to the high place that was at Gibeon. For God's tent of meeting, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, had made in the wilderness, was there. And we know that through the history of Israel, it got moved around quite a bit. Eventually, it winds up here in Gibeon, where Solomon goes and wants to visit it. Starting again in verse 5, moreover, the bronze altar that Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, had made was there in front of the tabernacle of the Lord. And Solomon and the assembly inquired at it. Solomon went up there to the bronze altar before the Lord, which was at the tent of meeting, and he offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. And that night God appeared to Solomon, and he said to him, ask what I should give you. Solomon said to God, you have shown great and steadfast love to my father David, and have made me succeed him as king. O Lord God, let your promise to my father David now be fulfilled. For you have made me king over a people as numerous as the dust of the earth. Give me now wisdom and knowledge to go out and come in before this people. For who can rule this great people of yours? And God answered Solomon, because this was in your heart, and you have not asked for possessions, wealth, honor, or the life of those who hate you, and have not even asked for long life, but have asked for wisdom and knowledge for yourself, that you may rule my people over whom I have made you king. Wisdom and knowledge are granted to you. But I will also give you riches, possessions, and honor, such as none of the kings who were before you, and none after you shall have the like. So Solomon came from the high place of Gibeon, from the tent of meeting to Jerusalem. And there he reigned over Israel. All right, we want to dissect this passage a little bit together tonight. But before we do, I want us to just look at what happens in this story. Solomon asked God for wisdom. And what does God end up doing? He gives him wisdom and knowledge. But he gives him even more than that, right? God ends up giving him all the other things as well. All the things that God said, because you didn't ask for these things, I'll give them to you anyway. He says, I'll give you wealth and honor. I'll give you riches and possessions, so that no one before you has had things to the level that you will, and no one after you will either. Now, can't you just hear, like if Solomon was in a classroom with a bunch of middle school students, when he gives this answer, I want wisdom, them oohing and awing over his answer, like they're rethinking, maybe I should have said that instead. And sometimes I think we read this story that way. Like Solomon broke the system, and he ended up getting everything that he could have asked for because he had this answer that was better than any answer he could have given. Sometimes I think we read the story this way. But if that were the case, then why would this story be recorded? Why would it be recorded in Chronicles, which Stephen mentioned last week is a repeating of a history that has already been recorded for the people of Israel? What history is worth repeating if the moral of this story is, okay, if God lets you ask Him for something in a dream or a vision, then you probably just need to ask for wisdom. Like, how practical is that? How many of God's people are going to get that kind of an opportunity? We're not told that Solomon could only ask for one thing. He could have asked for many things. And we probably know that this isn't one of what the writer's hopes is for his audience, that they would take this away. So what in this story is history worth repeating tonight? I want to draw your attention back to verse 6. What does Solomon do that leads to God appearing to him in this vision of this dream? What is it that he does at this tent of meeting in Gibeon? He makes an offering, right? He makes a sacrifice to the Lord. It says in verse 6 that he offered 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord on that day. The very first thing that the chronicler wants us to know about Solomon in this account is that he goes with all of his officials, like everybody. It seems like anyone who is anyone goes with Solomon to this tent of meeting. And the very first thing that we're told that Solomon does is he makes this offering, 1,000 burnt offerings to the Lord. His first act as the king. What I want to make clear tonight is this. Solomon's wisdom, shown to us here by his wise decision to sacrifice to the Lord. And I would argue that that is where Solomon's wisdom begins, is actually in his decision to go to the tent of meeting and to sacrifice to the Lord. Solomon's wisdom here begets wisdom. That's an old word, but I think we understand what it means tonight. Solomon's wisdom it begets more wisdom. And that is the history that is worth repeating. Solomon offers sacrifices, and he does that pretty generously. 1,000 offerings. What do we see God do in return? God offers him everything more than he could have asked. God offers him anything. So Solomon then turns, and in that vein of wisdom, wisdom begets wisdom. Solomon asks God for wisdom. He says, how can I rule over this great people? I'm just asking that you keep your promise to my father David, which you've already done, God. And what was that promise? But that God would establish David's heir on the throne and rule over him like a father over his son. That he would guide him in the ways that he needs to go. Solomon says, you've already kept your promise. What more can I ask for? Give me wisdom so that I could rule over your people. God then gives him everything. Everything more than wisdom. Wisdom and knowledge, absolutely. But even more than that, God gives him everything that he could have asked for. Solomon then, if we were to continue the story, what happens after Solomon's wise choice here? Well, Solomon makes another wise choice. Solomon decides in chapter 2, he says, I need to build a temple for the Lord. He says, I want to build a house for my God. God blesses him then. What does God do? God blesses him with an alliance with the king of Tyre, who just so happens to have the workers that Solomon needs to help accomplish this task. It's also not hurtful that he's now in a political alliance with the kingdom of Tyre. Like God is looking out for him even still. He decides to build a temple. God looks out for him with political alliances and resources to do the job that he set out in his heart to do, alongside the men that David, his father, had prepared to do this work. Solomon then, if we were to read chapters 3 and 4, he spares no expense in the building of that temple. If you were to read chapters 3 and 4, it would blow your mind. If you don't want to listen to the rest of what I say tonight, then maybe you should do that. I'm going to say whatever you need to do, I understand. But look at what Solomon does in chapters 3 and 4. He is going to spare no expense in the building of this temple. One of the things that stands out probably the most is that Solomon takes and he overlays the most holy place of the temple with gold. But it's not just like a little bit of gold. The Bible tells us that it's 600 talents of gold. That would equate out to, in our time, if we were to estimate about how much gold that would be, you can estimate, as scholars do, that that's roughly around 23 tons of gold. Like that's how much gold is like overlaid in the most holy of places. It's such an astounding number that many historians want to discount it. But biblical scholars look and they say, look at what other kings did for their gods. It's not that much of a stretch. Solomon builds a temple that is truly like no other. And church, that's because he believes his God is like no other. Look at what he says in chapter 2, verse 5, whenever he writes to the king Hiram of Tyre. What does he say about this temple that he wants to build? Verse 5, he says, "The house that I am about to build will be great, for our God is greater than other gods." Solomon builds a temple that's unlike any other temple because he believes his God is unlike any other God. He's greater than all of those gods that have their own temples. But verse 6, "Who is able to build him a house? Since heaven, even highest heaven, cannot contain him. Who am I to build a house for him, except as a place to make offerings before him?" That humility that we saw in Solomon when he said, who can rule over your people, God, continues in this conversation with the king of Tyre. He says, really, truly, who am I to build a house for God? The highest heaven can't contain him. I can't build him a house except as a place where we can make offerings to him, as Solomon has done at the very beginning of this account when he goes to the tent of meeting. God then decides, because of Solomon's wise choice, because of Solomon sparing no expense, he indwells that temple. He lives in that temple. And what we see at the end of chapter 5 is that Solomon brings the Ark of the Covenant into the temple. And we're told that God's presence fills it in such a way that the priests have to leave, because the cloud is too heavy, they can't be in there. And all the while, the singers of the chorus are singing these words over that new place as it's dedicated. They sing praise to the Lord, for He is good, for His steadfast love endures forever. Solomon's wisdom tonight begets wisdom. And for the children of Israel, and for us, that is history that is worth repeating. God blesses Solomon along every step of his journey because Solomon's wisdom is that he seeks to bring honor and glory to the name of God before all other things. Solomon's wisdom was not just asking God for wisdom, which we often think about. That's the story that we hear. That's the story we're told. It was asking from the God who could truly give him wisdom. Solomon's wisdom is that he trusted in the God of heaven and sought to bring him honor and praise above all things. Solomon believed that the God of Israel was a God that could be trusted, and he put his trust in him. That's the history that is worth repeating tonight. And I think whenever we step back and we look at the history of God's people, it's easy for us to see why the chronicler would want for the people of Israel to remember this account. After all, this is written to a people who have come out of exile, who have seen a new temple that has been built. And the chronicler writes to them and says, don't forget, as we have come back from our exile, as we have successfully rebuilt the temple and are in the process of rebuilding the walls, what true wisdom looks like. True wisdom is following God, seeking to bring Him honor and praise. We're going to get into plenty of examples in our series on what not to do as God's people. It's history worth repeating, but don't repeat it exactly as it was. It's history worth repeating because it helps us to stay out of trouble. But this history is history that brings wisdom. And that wisdom, if it's followed to its end, begets more wisdom and brings our God honor and praise. And it's not just true for the people who this book was first written to. It's true for us again today. I find it interesting that Solomon is often credited with those words in Proverbs. Some of the most famous Proverbs. You might recognize these words when I read them to you. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of what? You know it. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Solomon writes those words, we believe, and they go on to be a proverb that the Jewish people remembered for centuries after Solomon's death. Solomon's wisdom, even in the things that he wrote down, even in the things that were written down and were recorded about Solomon, his wisdom brings more wisdom to God's people and to the generations who followed him. Church, that's the lesson tonight. So the question is, in what ways can we make history worth repeating in our time? Looking at the story of Solomon. In what way could we live that would cause future generations to say, yes, that is what we want to do as well. We want to follow in the footsteps of those people at that time. Wisdom begets wisdom. And wisdom starts with seeking to praise and honor the God that we believe in all that we do. I cannot give a specific example tonight because there are so many examples that we could go to. Within our culture, what might this look like? If we, first and foremost, above all things, seek to bring praise and honor to our God in a culture that is constantly screaming for us to bring praise and honor to ourselves. Might it be history worth repeating for the generations that come after us if people are able to look at us and even if they disagree with what we teach and what we believe about our God, if they're able to look and say, those people were truly committed to what they believed. And because of their wisdom in constantly seeking to bring honor and praise to their God, even whenever we disagreed with them, our world, our country, our state, our community, our neighborhood was a better place because of the things that they sought first and foremost to accomplish with their lives. Church, we have the opportunities. They're right before us. If we live like this, if we seek wisdom from the one who can truly give it to us by trying to bring him honor and praise, then our community will see. What might that look like for you this week? How might you respond to this message? Maybe there is a difficult situation at work. Maybe there are some challenges that you're having with a coworker. What would it look like? What would wisdom look like in a scenario like that? What outcome would be best for you and for those people that you work with? Maybe you go to school. Maybe you're a teacher at a school. And you find yourself dealing with a student who just needs a little bit of extra love. How might you show God's wisdom? How might you seek God's wisdom as you interact with that student or with that other person at your school? Maybe tonight you need to respond to this message by seeking true wisdom that comes to us through Christ. Christ is the wisdom of God, is he not? And tonight you can come and believing in him, be baptized in his name, be washed clean of your sins, be forgiven of those, and rise to walk a new life. A life that puts the wisdom of God above all the other wisdoms that the world seeks to offer you. All the other cheap wisdoms that will not bring you happiness in this world. I can't promise you that following God will always make you happy, but it always brings joy to those who seek our God. And there's wisdom in seeing joy is more valuable than happiness. Our world needs to know that. However you may need to respond to this message tonight, I ask that you would seek wisdom from the one who can truly give it as we stand and as we sing.